The Verran came to the Kelthus Reach the way most conquerors arrive. Quietly, then everywhere at once. Marin Solis was repairing a water reclaimer on the third shelf of the colony's eastern ridge when the first shadow fell across the valley. She straightened, shielded her eyes, and watched the descent. A single Verran scout vessel, slate gray, shaped like something that had forgotten it used to be alive, settled into the flats below with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once in its history needed to hurry. She watched it for a long time. Then she went back to the reclaimer, finished her splice and climbed down. That was 12 days ago. Now the Verran had 3 ships in the flats, 2 on the North Ridge, and a relay station humming on the hill above the Solis family's homestead. Marin's father said they were surveyors. Her mother said they were cartographers. The colony administrator, a tired man named Osi, who had been administrator for 19 years and looked it, said they were assessors, and that assessors historically preceded something worse. Marin had her own theory, which she kept to herself. The colony had 43 families, a secondary school that doubled as a medical bay, and a market square that on 7G smelled like fried dough and burnt sweet cane. It was not a significant place by any measure the Verran would recognize. That was part of what worried Marin. The Verran, from everything the colonial datanet said, did not notice insignificant places. They assessed them and moved on. They had been in the Kelthus Reach for 12 days and had not moved on. She was in the market square, sitting on the low wall above the dry fountain, when she first saw him. He was sitting on an overturned crate beside the sealed entrance to the Verran relay station, which had been placed with casual arrogance directly against the east wall of the square. He wore clothes that did not fit right, too formal for the colony, too worn for ceremony, a long gray coat that might have been fashionable in the capital 30 years ago. He was young, 16, maybe 17. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched the square with the stillness of someone who had been waiting a very long time and had made a kind of peace with it. Marin watched him for a while. He didn't move. She crossed the square. "You work for them?" she asked, meaning the Verran. There were 3 Verran visible from where she stood. Tall, angular beings with that particular quality of deliberate movement they all had, as if each gesture had been chosen in advance and executed precisely. Unnerving if you let yourself think about it. The boy looked at her. His eyes were the color of old smoke, and they looked at her with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with being tired. "I work with them," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He considered this. "Most days." His name, he told her, was Fen. He was, and here he paused, watching her face, measuring something, 53 years old. He said it the way you'd say something you've said 10,000 times and have stopped expecting to be believed. Marin looked at him. He looked 17. The gray coat, the formal bearing, the eyes with that smoke in them. None of it added up to 53, and all of it added up to something she couldn't name. 53, she said. "I stopped aging when I was 16. I was on a Verran research vessel. I was part of something they were doing." He said it without heat, without bitterness, the way you'd describe a road you'd walked 1,000 times. "That was 37 years ago. They kept studying me for a while. Now they keep me around because I'm useful." "Why are you useful?" He looked across the square at the colony families moving between stalls. "Because I understand them," he said, meaning the Verran. "And I understand you." He paused. "Both of those things are rarer than you'd think." Marin sat down on the crate beside him. She wasn't entirely sure why. She came back the next day, and the day after that. There was something she needed to understand about the Verran, and Fen was the only possible source. And she told herself that was the only reason. He was easy to talk to in the way that people with nothing left to prove are easy to talk to. He didn't perform or deflect. When he didn't know something, he said so. When she asked a question that made him uncomfortable, his face showed it plainly, and then he answered anyway. She learned over those days what she had suspected. The Verran were not cartographers or surveyors. They were assessors. Osi had been right about that. But what they assessed was not land or resources or strategic value. What they assessed was readiness. The Verran had a concept, Fen explained, that translated roughly as Rakim. It referred to the metabolic cost of maintaining a thing, an organism, a colony, a civilization. Whether the energy required to keep it running was being returned in kind. The Verran believed, with the serene certainty of a species that had been at this for 400 years, that the universe was a ledger, and that entries in the debit column were eventually corrected. They think we're a bad investment, Marin said. They think you might be, they're still assessing. How long does the assessment take? Fen was quiet for a moment. In my experience, he said carefully, the assessment is usually finished before the assessors leave. She thought about that all the way home. Her father was at the kitchen table when she got in. Maps spread across the surface, the kind of paper maps he kept from the original survey that had brought her grandparents here. He was not a sentimental man, but he kept those maps. She looked at them as she passed. The valley drawn in her grandmother's careful hand, the ridge positions, the water sources, the places named for things her family had felt in the first year. They've been running scans, he said without looking up. Deeper than last week, below the bedrock. Looking for what? Don't know. That's the problem. Marin went to bed and lay awake and listened to the low harmonic hum of the Verran relay station on the hill. It had a frequency that wasn't quite sound, that you felt in the bones of your jaw. She went back to the square. Tell me something true, she said to Fen. She sat beside him on the wall this time. He'd moved from the crate. The square was quieter, midday, the light falling heavy on the stone. He thought about it. The Verran don't understand why you stay, he said. The colony. Any of the colonies. They understand resource extraction. They understand strategic positioning. They understand survival. What they don't understand is, he searched for the word, attachment. Why you'd stay in a place that costs you. Why the name your grandmother gave that ridge means something to you. Why you'd repair a water reclaimer instead of requesting a new one. He looked at his hands. That's not inefficiency to you. It's something else entirely. And they can't measure it, which means they distrust it. Do you understand it? He was quiet. The harmonic hum from the relay station pressed at the edges of the silence. I used to, he said. I've been with them a long time. She looked at his face, 16 years old by any measurement available to light, 53 by everything else. There was something in the line of his mouth, a compression. Like a man who had learned to carry something heavy enough that he no longer noticed the weight, only occasionally noticed the absence when he put it down. What was it like, she asked, when they first took you? I was on a transport to the outer stations. I was 16. They pulled us out of the lane, standard Verran procedure. They do it all the time, it's not usually. He stopped. Started again. They were running an experiment. Something about cellular stasis under specific field conditions. I was the one it worked on. Or didn't work on, depending on how you count. He touched the collar of the gray coat. They were fascinated. They studied me for years. What they couldn't work out was why it bothered me. To them, the cessation of aging is simply a condition, a data point. The fact that I had a life I expected to live, that was now altered. This was not a variable they had thought to account for. I think I believe you, Marin said. It came out quietly, and she meant it. Not the 53 years. Those she couldn't entirely hold in her mind, but the thing underneath it. The specific weight of being fixed in place while everything else moved. Of knowing what you were supposed to be, and being unable to become it. He looked at her with those smoke-colored eyes, and something shifted in them. Some small recalibration. The Verran lead assessor files her report on the 15th day, he said. It wasn't a change of subject. That's 4 days from now. And if the assessment concludes we're a bad investment. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She went home. She walked through the square, the fried dough smell, the sweet cane smoke. Her neighbor Darren arguing loudly and happily with the produce trader about the price of root vegetables. The sound of children on the far end of the market. A song one of them was singing that Marin half recognized from primary school. She walked slowly and looked at all of it and felt something clarify in her chest. She found Osi at the administration building. I need to see the colony's generation records, she said. Economic output, biodiversity catalogs, every study anyone has done on this valley. Everything. She paused. And I need help. Osi looked at her. He was a tired man but not a stupid one. Help with what? Making a case, she said. The next 3 days were the hardest work of Marin's life, and she'd grown up farming a volcanic ridge. Osi reached into drawers she hadn't known existed. Old archivist Timsison from the school came with boxed records going back 4 generations. Darren, the produce trader, brought yield data and a hand-drawn chart of the valley's microclimate shifts. The Vargas family brought soil cores. Young Pete, 18 years old, barely, studying remotely for an engineering certification, stayed up 2 nights running and built a data model that made the valley's subsurface water system legible in a way no survey had managed before. Marin's mother contributed something unexpected. 30 years of phenological notes, the kind of obsessive record-keeping her family had always teased her for. First, flowering dates and migration arrivals and frost lines, the valley rendered as a single living system across 3 decades. It was not, Marin knew, what the Verran would find impressive. It was not efficient. It was not optimized. It was the record of a community of people who had looked at a difficult piece of land and decided it was worth the trouble of knowing deeply, and who had kept that record not because anyone asked them to, but because that was the kind of people they were. She brought it to Fen the morning of the 14th day. He sat with it for a long time. She watched him go through it, the data models, the soil cores, Tamsin's boxed records, her mother's phenological notes. He turned pages. He stopped on her mother's notes. He read something and turned back and read it again. "This is the valley," he said. It wasn't a question, 4 generations of it. He was quiet. Then, the Verran assess outputs. They don't. They've never developed a framework for what you'd call investment. The future-facing kind. The kind where you keep records of first flowering dates for 30 years, not because you need to, but because some part of you believes it will matter. Does it? He looked at her. I don't know if it'll work. I want to be honest with you about that. I know, but I know how the lead assessor thinks, he said. And I think, if I can position this correctly, there's a frameshiming she hasn't encountered. She's never had to account for a colony that's been accumulating knowledge of a place the way your people have. He touched the edge of her mother's notebook. This isn't data. This is love made legible, and I don't know if the Verran have a category for it, but I think the absence of that category might be something we can use. He looked very young and very old at the same time, and Marin felt the strange doubling of it. The boy who had been fixed at 16, the 53 years of weight behind his smoke-colored eyes, and understood that this was what made him useful in a way no Verran could be. He was the space between. He could hold both. "Come with me," he said. The lead assessor's name, or the closest approximation Fen could render in a human mouth, was something like Velis. She received them in the relay station's primary chamber, which was cool and gray, and smelled faintly of mineral dust. She was tall even for a Verran, her movements with that characteristic quality of forethought, every gesture preceded by a small stillness. Fen spoke to her in Verran. He spoke for a long time. Marin watched the assessor's face, what she'd learned to read as expression in Verran physiology, the small postural shifts, the way the assessor's secondary eyes tracked across the materials Marin had brought. Velis asked a question. Fen answered. Velis asked another. Then Velis reached out and picked up Marin's mother's phenological notebook. She opened it, turned pages. Her secondary eyes moved across the handwriting. 30 years of first frost dates, of arrival dates for birds Marin could name from childhood, of small precise observations made by a woman who believed the world repaid attention. The relay station hummed. Fen translated quietly, just for Marin. She's asking who made these records. My mother, Marin said. Fen told her. Velis asked another question. She wants to know the purpose, the intended recipient, what these records were made for. Marin thought about her mother at the kitchen table in the low evening light, writing in that small, precise hand, not for anyone, for the valley, for the record of itself. No intended recipient, Marin said. She made them because she believed the valley deserved to be known. Fen translated it. Velis set the notebook down. There was a long silence. That's a particular quality, a compression of attention. Marin had learned, over the past 2 weeks, what Verran consideration looked like. It looked like absolute stillness. Then Velis spoke. Fen was quiet for a moment after she finished. When he turned to Marin, his face was doing something complicated. She says, he began and stopped. Tried again. The Verran have assessed 10,000 colonies in the Kelthis Reach over 400 years. She says they have a framework, the remainder calculation, that has never failed to produce a useful assessment. He paused. She says your colony's remainder score is negative. By their metrics, cost exceeds return. Marin felt the bottom drop out of something in her chest. But, Fen said. She waited. She says the notebook introduces a variable the framework cannot accommodate, an entity that produces records for no recipient, at sustained cost, over multiple generations. This behavior pattern appears, in Verran analytical terms, to be non-convergent. It does not resolve. They have no endpoint for it. He looked at Marin. The Verran don't make decisions in the presence of unresolved variables. They reopen the file. They're not leaving. They're not leaving for the reason you feared, he said carefully. They're staying to continue the assessment. But a reopened file is. It's time. It's a different thing than a closed one. His voice was very even. Your colony has time. The colony had time. Marin walked out of the relay station into the sharp afternoon light of the valley and stood in the market square and breathed. The sweet cane smoke. The sound of the fountain. OC had apparently turned it back on at some point. She hadn't noticed. Darren's voice carrying across the square in what sounded like the continuation of the root vegetable argument, which she suspected was less about root vegetables than it was about the simple pleasure of the argument. The song from somewhere, children's voices. The half-remembered primary school tune. She stood there and let it be real. Fen came out behind her. He stopped beside her and looked at the square. Thank you, she said. He shook his head slightly. You made the case. I translated it. You knew what would stop her. I knew what the framework couldn't hold. He looked at the fountain. An unresolved variable. 43 families who've been paying attention to a valley for 4 generations. Not because the ledger demanded it, but because they decided it was worth knowing. Something moved in his face. That compression again, that carrying of weight. I've been with the Verran a long time. I've watched them close a lot of files. I've never, he stopped. Never what? He was quiet for a moment. I've never had something to translate before. Not something that mattered. He said the last word carefully, like picking up something he wasn't sure would hold his weight. I've been useful. I've been a bridge. I've never actually stood on the bridge myself. He looked at the square, at the families, at Darren's argument, and the fountain and the children's voices. This valley, these people, the notebook, he paused. I think I understand it again. What I said I used to understand. Marin looked at him, 16 by the light, 53 by everything behind his eyes, and thought about what it was to be fixed in place while the world moved. She thought about what it cost. She thought about the specific kind of courage required to reach across the distance between 2 completely different ways of being and say, I think, I believe you. You could stay, she said. If you wanted. He looked at her. The assessment is reopened. The Verran are staying. You could work from here. Be somewhere. She paused. Be somewhere for more than 14 days. The afternoon light on the square. The fountain running, her grandmother's ridge name carved in the stone at its base. The low harmonic of the relay station, but softer now, less insistent. Fen didn't answer immediately. He looked at the valley, the ridge, the long particular gold of the light at this hour. The way it fell across the market square, as if it had been doing it forever, and intended to continue. There are 20,000 other colonies in the Reach, he said. In the next 2 years, Verran assessment teams will come to all of them. Marin understood. You'll translate. I'll stand on the bridge, he said. She looked at him. The weight behind his eyes had not changed. It wouldn't. It was 37 years and counting. It was the specific unasked-for burden of a life that had been altered without consent. But there was something else there now. Something that had come back. She recognized it from her mother's notebook. The long returning of attention to a thing. The belief that paying witness was its own kind of investment. He reached into the gray coat and produced a small notebook, battered, the cover worn at the corners. He held it out to her. Your mother's record-keeping, he said. She might want to know what it did. Marin took the notebook. It was her mother's, she realized. Not a copy, the original. Valis must have returned it through Fen. She opened the cover. First frost. 14th day of second month, year of colony founding plus 11. Her mother's handwriting, small and precise and utterly certain of its own importance. She closed it carefully. Go, she said. 20,000 colonies. He straightened the gray coat. A habitual gesture, she'd noticed it before. The small adjusting of a thing that didn't quite fit, worn anyway. He looked across the square one more time. Then he turned and walked toward the relay station, and the light caught him from behind. And for a moment he was just a young man walking with the carriage of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time, and had recently, for the first time in years, glimpsed what it might be for. Marin stood at the fountain and watched him go. Above the eastern ridge the Verran ships hummed. Below them, in the valley her grandmother had named, and her mother had spent 30 years learning to know, the colony was alive and specific and unresolved, and would remain so. She thought about 20,000 colonies. She thought about a boy who was 53 years old, who understood two kinds of people, who had just remembered what it was to stand for something, rather than simply between things. She thought about what it took. Not the speech, not the data model, not even the careful diplomacy of Fenn's translation in that cool gray room. She thought about her mother at the kitchen table in the low evening light, writing down the first frost date for the 11th year in a row, not for any recipient, not for any ledger, simply because she believed the valley deserved to be known. There was something specifically human in that. Merrin felt it with sudden clarity, the way you suddenly feel the ground after a long time without it. The Verran had 400 years and 10,000 assessments, and a framework that had never failed. They had not in 400 years once thought to wonder whether an unasked-for love letter to a piece of land might be the most efficient thing in the universe. Whether the future was being built, patient and cumulative, in a handwriting too small for their instruments to read. The framework couldn't hold it. The file stayed open. The colony breathed.